When you want to research Civil War veterans, what sources do you consult? Join me today as I explain how you can research a group of men when you start with a unit roster and pension records, and you are attempting to link them to their family. Howdy, welcome back to Family History Fanatics. If you're new here, I'm Devin Noel Lee, and today we're diving into the reality of a specific genealogical research project. Whether you're just starting out or have been at it for a while, you'll discover how often genealogists do and don't practice what they teach or preach, but ultimately strive to deepen their connections to their roots. If you're passionate about discovering your past, make sure to subscribe and sign up for email reminders for new video releases. In my quest to understand the men who served with my Civil War ancestor, William James Townsend of the Ohio 133rd Company K, I started with the unit roster. I expanded the research with details from pension filings. My next step was to use the two clues from these two record sets to research a narrow set of information about the life before and after the war for the men of the entire regiment. If you've been following along, yeah, I'm that crazy. In any case, we're researching these men, but we don't want to dive too deeply into the story that we never get back to the original purpose of researching the men, which is to write William's story. So with that in mind, let's remember that I initially planned on focusing on the following resources that would keep me limited as I researched these nearly 1,000 men. So death records, find a grave or billion grave records. Now these two sources were often based on the death dates from the Fold 3 pension index clues that I found. Remember in the previous video, I told you how good the Fold 3 pension index cards are. So if you're not using the ones on Ancestry and Family Search with the ones on Fold 3, you might be missing out on some important clues. We have marriage records, and if I can't find marriage records, then the 1900 census is a very good substitute for at least a general idea of when a marriage date may have happened, because that question was asked on the 1900 census. Some clues for who the men married are also from the pension index files, and this is from either the one on Fold 3 or the one on Ancestry and Family Search. You use those names and it will help you link up to the 1900 census, and then hopefully we can get to the 1860 census because that tells us where these men were living prior to the Civil War. If I can't find them in the 1860 census, then I looked for the 1870 census. At least I knew maybe where they went after the war. The other record set that I checked out was the 1863 Civil War draft registration. Now, I need to investigate further why all of the men did not appear in the Civil War draft. I think some people might not have been old enough, some of the younger men that served in this unit. I know that a number of men were off doing other service, so they wouldn't appear in the draft because they were already serving. But if you know of some other reasons why men would not have appeared in the Civil War draft, I would love to hear your thoughts. Finally, another really great resource to look into is the 1890 Veterans Census Schedule. Remember, the 1890 census burned with the exception of about 6,000 names, but the 1890 Veterans Schedule survived. And what's really, really great about the Veterans Schedule is it has a bit of details in most cases, not all, but in most cases, even if the men were living all around the country, the unit 133rd for Ohio with roughly the enlistment date and the release date, those appear on the census record. So you can link the men together and then put them in a location. And if you've been struggling with those other records, then maybe now you have some clues to go there. If you can't find the men in that veteran schedule, one of the other things you may find is the widow. Typically, the entry will be the man and the widow and her name. So often both names show up. So check out the 1890 census. He may show up in that census even if he is deceased because as a widow appears there, and that gives you really great clues. Some other details I look for is there's this really good soldiers profile collection on Ancestry. It's often a repetition of what I found in the roster, but sometimes it has some extra details that are very handy, so you want to check that out as well. While using Family Search and Ancestry, I also discovered other military-related sources. These were veteran headstone applications, GAR documents. There is a derivative source called the Ohio Soldier Grave Registration, and it records the burial location for veterans if they were buried in Ohio. So that's kind of handy. The Soldiers' Home Records. Now, this can be locations around the country where a veteran would go to get some treatment, and it would tie him to his unit, and often it would tie him to the next of kin, sometimes his death date, sometimes his burial date, definitely his injuries, which I was very curious to record at some point. Notice how much there is, and I haven't even covered everything. So that would get you started to stay limited, right? We want to focus on who the men were, where were they living shortly before the war, and some details about their survivability. Did they get a pension file? And ultimately, when the pension files come online, can I find some other fascinating details about the pension process and see how that correlates with my ancestor, William Townsend? When you're doing online research, many of us have our tried and true favorite places to go. And as you all know here on Family History Fanatics, I am a Family Search fangirl. I really like the platform. But I might actually have to revise my favoritism for that platform. My initial plan was to research profiles on Family Search to see if other people had already done the research that I had gathered, and then I can skip over those men, maybe add a few details here and there, and then see if I could also pick up some records along the way from that list that I was after. Well, it sounded like a great idea. I really didn't have enough seed information to find profiles on Family Search. And instead, I needed to do, I wouldn't say original research, but I needed to research again. So think of the Thomas McKenzie research do-overs. And I was basically doing a do-over, even though I was doing it for the first time. But I knew other people had many of the records discovered for the men I was looking for. And so the platform that helped me the most was actually Ancestry. I could find one record, and then I would quickly be tapped into another series of record hints, record trees, creating these profiles that I felt was not easy to access through Family Search. So, believe it or not, for this project, Ancestry triumphed in the one that I started getting most records from. And then later, I went over to Family Search and picked up some of the records on there. Now, as I started diving into all those sources I told you, primarily using Ancestry and then going over to Family Search afterwards, I had to expand my spreadsheet because the columns I had previously weren't sufficient. So I added a field for alternate name. I soon quickly discovered that in the roster, many of the names were misspelled. And in one case, I did pick this up in the pension file. The name was an alias. And so I needed to really gather alternate name files so I can keep the original roster name and then the other variations or the more accurate spelling of the name if the roster was mistaken. So let me give you an example of when in the roster there was a man named Eli, Whighgt. And I'm guessing that's white because later I discovered that the correct spelling of the name was Elias, and he might have gone by Eli, and it was white, like the color white. So sometimes the names are phonetically spelled, and it's helpful to have that alternative name calling so that I can, if I decide to have the profile in my future tree, ancestry, then and family search and use the correct name, I can tie it back to the roster name. The next field that I added was birthplace. As I began to see that many of the soldiers were foreign born, I found that very interesting. Remember, I'm going to eventually write the story about who was serving with William Townsend. And if I'm seeing that this unit has quite a number of Germans or Swedes or Irishmen, now I can hear in my mind's eye the accents that are surrounding my ancestor. Not only do you hear the accent, but wouldn't it be interesting to see how these diverse people served together? That is why we're after some of these details. So I added a birthplace column. I decided to separate the spouses' names out and the marriage names out. And then I started having a first wife column and a second wife column and a third. After a third, I gave up. I was like, I'm not going to make more columns because there was very few who had more than 3 wives. There were a few, though. And in that case, I just put them in the notes. That I just kept those columns separate just because I wanted to see when were people getting married. And were they married at the time of their service? Were they on their second marriage? Lots of great questions to be investigating. The reason why I started having the 2 columns for spouses initially, and then third or fourth, is that the woman who was listed on the pension index card was not often the woman the soldier was married to when they went to serve in the Civil War. And I found that interesting. Sometimes they would get a pension and they would marry somebody shortly before or after receiving that pension. And this is long after the war. They would get their pension in 1888, 1890, 1902. And if I don't take the time to realize, wait, they got married this time, did they have a previous wife? Okay, now we can learn whether they were single or married during their war service. I created another column because when you start getting into the census records, you start recognizing names that were in the unit. And sure enough, as you start piecing the details together, you find that, like my ancestor, William James Townsend, his brother served in the unit. I think I figured out a relative of William's wife and how William and his wife met. And so I started putting these other relatives in service in this column. I found father-son, I found brothers, I found first cousins, I found brothers-in-laws, I found an uncle and a nephew. It was really fascinating. I actually found 3 generations of folks. I think this is the Ennis family, maybe not 3 generations. However, brothers and their sons served. So I needed to get to when when I was building a partial tree to show how they were connected, I had to go up a generation to link the two brothers together. And then I was able to link the sons of this man together and the sons of this man together. And then you can start seeing, you get the idea. It's pretty crazy. I also added a notes column, something separate from the biographical notes column. This is when someone became too difficult to separate from other same name individuals. I noted this in the notes column. This helped me know if a row of research is blank. It's not for lack of trying. Sometimes there was not enough information from the roster to tie the man to any of the censuses, especially since the man did not show up in the pension record. I just have a year of birth, a rough age, and the 2 times that they appear in military service, their enlistment date and their discharge date, and that's all I have for the gentleman. So I went ahead, and when I didn't have anything else and I'd done valiant research, I made a note, not enough clarifying details to separate him from someone else, or not enough details to place him anywhere before or after the war. After 2 weeks, I had a research file with all of these biographical details for 1,000 men. So not too bad. The spreadsheet was working. I was gathering my information, and now I could start writing. Yay! Right? Well, yes, I actually could start writing the historical content into my story about William James Townsend. Sure, there's gaps and there's likely mistakes, but I can keep things general and still tell a more accurate story. But if you're an astute genealogist, what have you noticed I haven't added in my spreadsheets? You have a guess? I battled with genealogy guilt that will not let me start writing. And in the next video, I will discuss that guilt and tell you about the 7-month tangent that made me regret starting this project in the first place. For now, I'm going to let you guess what I have not added to my research and why I'm feeling guilty. So take a guess and let me know what you think in the comments section below. Also, stop and take the moment and let me know, would you have started your research a little bit differently when you got to this point? You've got the spreadsheet, you're adding the information. Is there something you would have done differently? I'd be happy to hear your thoughts. This is Family History Fanatics reminding you that if family history work isn't fun, you're doing it wrong. And I'll see you in the next video.